Welcome to the Tech Talk Show with me, Kazeem, this great afternoon. And today we're going to be talking about static websites on Azure. And my guest on today's show is Bill Ayers. Hi, Bill, and welcome to the Tech Talk Show.
Hi, Kazeem. Great to be here.
Yes. So usually the tradition is for us to start things with an introduction. So Bill, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do for a living.
Okay, well, I do consultancy particularly around Microsoft 365 and a little bit of Azure as well. I do also a fair bit of training, so I do consultancy and training, and my background really is at least for the last 15 years or so, is SharePoint, and then that became Microsoft 365, and then that became Microsoft 365 and Azure. So as the technologies developed, it's been more difficult to specialize in just say SharePoint or something like that. So everything now, you have to know everything. So it gets broader and broader, and possibly shallower and shallower. I'm not sure, but try and stay on top of all these different technologies and everything moving so fast. So I'm a Microsoft trainer. I'm a MVP for Office development, and I'm also did the Microsoft Certified Master in SharePoint about 10 years ago, which everybody's forgotten about now. You can't do anymore. But so that was I sort of got into SharePoint in about 2003 or something like that, and been doing that. Before that, engineering software and all kinds of operating systems and languages.
Okay, 10 years is a very long time since you've been doing SharePoint. Wow. So now let's dig into today's topic proper, static websites on Azure Storage. I usually like to take out all assumptions now. So let's start with the basics first. What does it mean to say that a website is a static one?
Yeah, right. What's a static website? Right. So if you look back in history, a long way, even before SharePoint and in the early 90s, when websites and the World Wide Web became a thing, all the websites were static. You just had an HTML page, and that would be rendered, and then if you wanted to navigate to another page, you'd follow a link to the next page, and that would be another page on your on the server, on a disk on the server. And that was how all websites worked. And then over time, we've got more sophisticated. We say, well, we want to pull in data from this database, and so we need to have something running on the server side to do that and render content, or there's some dynamic content that's just generated on the fly. And so we want to do things. We want to build sort of more app-like experiences on the web. And so web serving, building a web server became much more complicated. And then we went into, well, we want people to be able to edit content who aren't technical. So we need a content management system that will allow a user to see a page and be able to go into a sort of edit mode or something like that. So anybody who's worked in SharePoint for a number of years will remember that SharePoint was actually Microsoft's content management system offering for about a decade. We don't really do that anymore in SharePoint, but there are easier, better tools to do it now as the technology's evolved. But that was how we used to build, or a way of building, fairly sophisticated public-facing websites. And I did a lot of that in the sort of 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, that sort of era. But it's very, very complicated to build a website like that. So there's now a bit of a move, and it's a kind of falls into this whole category of development models that we call serverless, in that we've kind of moved back to static websites again. Just like in the old days, we tried to serve static content, and that means we effectively don't have any any code running server side. If there's anything running, it's going to run on the client side, and the motivations for that are really for performance. So it's makes it much easier to build a high performance website if we just have all the content is static. The web server only has to serve the page. We used to do all kinds of caching strategies to overcome limitations, performance limitations on web applications, and that kind of does away with that. It also is very well suited to using something like a CDN, a content delivery network. If the content is static, it makes scaling much easier. It gives you lots of options for deployment. So if you're really all you're deploying is some content, then you have the option of, you can deploy it to a container, deploy it to a web app with a very simple server, or deploy it to, which we'll talk about in a minute, some of the static web hosting options in Azure, such as a storage account or the static web app. We'll talk about that as well. So it gives you a lot of flexibility and makes it a lot easier to deploy the solutions. It keeps it all simple, so the development story is a lot easier as well. And it's a much smaller attack surface from a security point of view. So the more complicated you build your web application in your web server, the more opportunity there is for somebody to come up with an exploit. And as we know, as soon as you put a web server on the internet, then within about 20 seconds, there are people trying to hack into it. So if you have a static web app, there's nothing really for them to hack, because the worst thing that can happen is you have some authenticated content and they get to that, but they can't get onto your website and start changing content and things like that, because there's nothing to change. It's all static. So that's the idea behind static web apps. Now you then get the problem of, okay, how do you do things where you do have dynamic content? And there are a couple of approaches to say, I've got some data and I want to render a page with each, like an items detail page for something that might be a record in a database. Well, one way is you generate, and there are site generators which will do this kind of thing. You generate all the content at build time or at deployment time, and take this data and produce pages from that. And that might be a practical solution if you have a fairly small number of records, a few hundreds of records. If you get into the sort of millions of records, then that approach doesn't really work anymore. And so you'll be doing something like have something client side that will call an API. And that API might be something serverless, like an Azure function or something like that, which will then go and call the database on your behalf. But it'll all be called from the client side, so it's all done in client side code. So this is generally static websites. The content is static. There's nothing running server side. I mean, there is, obviously, there has to be something running server side, but you're not writing code and maintaining server side code. And one of the approaches to this, one way of looking at this is people talk about Jamstack, which means JavaScript for all the everything dynamic is happening client side, using APIs. So that might be some sort of serverless function of some kind. An Azure function, for example, and then the M stands for Markdown. So that sort of gets around the problem of how do you make it easy to edit content, which we used to do with these very elaborate content management systems like Joomla or SharePoint or one of these CMSs. And Markdown gives you a kind of a more limited way of writing content, and you can say I can say a header and a link and an image, but not a huge amount of complexity that you get if you do full HTML development, which is more of a sort of a developer activity. So it's kind of Markdown has become one of the tools that's part of this story as well, where you've got that sort of replaces the content management piece in the sort of the static websites world.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarity. Another question I want to ask is, we know that Azure has many services for hosting websites. So I want to check with you, one, why host a website on Azure Storage? And I also do hear about this Azure Static Web Apps. So I also want to check what's the difference between Azure Static Web App and static website on Azure Storage.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the beauty of Azure Storage, it's been on Azure from the beginning. It's very inexpensive. So if you want to serve some web content, you can do that right inside Azure Storage. There's a facility for doing that, and they kind of provision a little tiny server that will give you things like give you an index page and a 404 page that you can customize. But otherwise, I will show this later if we've got time. We can do a quick demo, but it's very simple to set up, and that was really, I guess really to get that to work, you kind of need to have Azure CDN or some content delivery network layer on top of that. So it's just a place to store some content, and then you can serve that out. But typically the performance win is using a CDN. Now there are a few limitations with that approach. So it doesn't work so well when we start wanting to do things like, typically with a public facing website, we want to have a custom domain, and we want to have a SSL. We want to have transport layer security as well, HTTPS, and those are a little bit trickier to set up with a storage account. It's possible, and you can do it, but it's not a particularly easy, or in some cases not a totally elegant solution. So Microsoft came up with this the static web apps, which is kind of a halfway house now between. So the other thing you can do, of course, is you could go to Azure App Service and create a web app. And I've done this where I've essentially got a static website, and I've just got a 30-line Node.js server running that's just fetching the content and serving it, and that's all it's doing. But you can go one further. You can go to this fairly recent, in the last year or so, we've had the option for static web apps, which is a new service in Azure. It's not been GA for that long. And that is, I have to say, a better solution for, if you want to set something up. It will give you a number of things that you don't get with the storage account. It sorts out the whole custom domains, HTTPS is all pretty much, they give you a certificate and they'll manage the certificates. So it makes it really easy to serve that. They've also another thing with using the storage accounts is you've got to figure out, okay, what's my deployment process to get the content into my storage account? Not a difficult thing to do, but with the static web app solution that they've come up with, they give you the whole deployment story, so you can integrate it with your GitHub account or with some sort of DevOps flow. They give you a number of options for that. So, when you look at the whole package of what you get with the Azure static web app solution, very nice. There's also a layer that will give you some mapping of pages, a few rewrites and things like that, which you sometimes need to be able to do. So it's a much more complete solution to hosting a static web app than hosting it on just Azure Storage. And underlying it is a similar technology, but they've just developed that further. So I would recommend looking at the static web app solution. There are some limitations on how much storage you can have in there, and how many. There's a free tier and a paid tier, so you've got to look at the free and the paid and work out, is there sufficient storage there. Those are the two main things, are the storage limitations and the number of custom domains you can have per website. which is 2. So essentially, again, what you want to do is you typically want the www version of your domain, and then the root or apex domain as well. So you want to, if I'm on contoso.com, I want people to be able to navigate to contoso.com and to www.contoso.com. So anyway, all of that is sorted out for you on these static web apps, so that you've got the 2 domains, so that solves that problem as well. So yeah, there might be a situation where you just got a huge amount of data and you therefore steer towards the using a storage account.
Okay, thank you very much. I was going to check with you about SSL, but you answered that already. But a very quick one, do we get charged for the storage accounts that we're hosting on when we do static websites on Azure Storage?
Yeah. So the storage account is you're paying for the storage, but as you probably know, the costs are minuscule. There is no cheaper way of either of these options. Must be the cheapest way of hosting a website, and you're paying for the data. Egress and ingress, well, usually mainly egress. So you're paying for the data, but again, unless you've got a very busy website, those costs are going to be quite small. And even if you use a Azure CDN, it's absolutely ideal for a website that you just want to be sitting there, but it's not become the next Slashdot or one of these hugely successful sites. You want something that's going to be there, and if it doesn't get used much, it's not going to be costing you anything. Whereas if you use something like apps service or provision of VM, then that's a whole different range of costs around it.
Okay. All right then. So is there something you can show us to help us connect the dots with all these things we're talking about today?
Yeah, sure. So let me share my screen. And what am I sharing here? Let's share this one, I think. Yep, that looks right. I'm going to move that over. Oops, I'll move you over there, and we'll bring my so what I'll do is I'll just show you'd want to set up a storage account, and I've got one set up already, which is this one. So I just very quickly set up an Azure Storage account, and is this showing okay, Kazeem?
Yes, it is. It is.
Good. And if you scroll down, you'll see there's an option here called static website. So if you go to static website and go enabled, and I'd probably call my index file index.html, and maybe this could be 404.html or something like that, and save that. And what that will do is, so this is a new storage account, so there's nothing else in here. So if I go to containers, you can actually see there's that creates a container called $web, and I can only have one of these really per storage account, so probably need to create a storage account specifically for this. And then I can start uploading some content to it. So I could, let's see if it's go and find some files somewhere. So I've got, let me go to projects, and which one of these shall I use? Let's go for this one. And I'm just going to use something where I've got an index.html file. Just out of interest, what this project is doing is these are pages that I've generated. So I got a sort of a homegrown static site generator here that's generating this index HTML page and a few other pages as well. I'll just copy this one over just to show that there is some content there. So I've now uploaded that. So now if I go to the static site, there should be a link. Where's a link to go to it? Hang on. There's probably in properties, isn't it? That is actually this will get me there. Not blob. I don't go to blob. I need to go to the so that will be that's the endpoint for the blob storage account itself, but you get another endpoint. I think it is static website. It should be here. Here it is. So this is the endpoint, and it's, you know, not a very attractive URL. So demo.874 and so on. But this is actually, if I copy, I would copy it into my browser, and then if I go there. So that is my, there's no CSS. I didn't upload the CSS files and all the rest of it, but that is running there on that endpoint. Now, the next thing I'd want to do is probably I'd need to go and say, well, I'm going to set up CDN. So down here somewhere, there's Azure CDN, and I could then go to there and use the CDN, Azure CDN endpoint, and map that to a custom domain. So I'd have to go into my domain registrar or wherever my DNS is hosted and set up some records, and I won't go through that now, but you set up some records that will do a CNAME to redirect to www.contoso.com or whatever it is. And then it gets a little bit more complicated to get to the root domain, the apex domain. So you have to set up an alias record for that. And for that, you then need to set up do a bit of verification. So it takes a little while to set this up. It's not super fast to configure, but you can do it. So you can set up the Apex domain and then the www domain, and then for SSL, yeah, you know that's a feature of Azure CDN as well. So it'll do the mapping to take care of the SSL for you. So you can set it up this way, but a much easier way actually is to go, instead of setting up I recommend now that it's GA and is or working, I would say create a resource, a static web app, static, I think a static app. Here it is, a static web app, and go down this route and create one of these. And it's the usual thing when you're creating a new resource in Azure, and set this up here. The only thing I really need to set up is the name, and then I get an option here, you see, to link it to a GitHub account, or you can use some other. So if I click GitHub, you know, I can build somehow my static site and then deploy it, or rather do a commit and then push it up into GitHub, and then that will start a GitHub automation process that will then deploy it into the static web app. And you can also have a production and a sort of a staging slot or something like that if you want to. So that's using GitHub. You can also use a number of these. Sure why it's not giving us some more options here, but you can use some of the existing templates using this approach, like Gatsby, for example. So just to really talk about this, but here's a site. This is an interesting site called which is jamstack.org. So I mentioned Jamstack, which means JavaScript, APIs, and Markdown, and they have a list of all these sort of site generators. I tend to just do this manually and just do the HTML, but there are some very sophisticated ones which will start and give you a website. And in some cases, you know, for example, Gatsby is using React framework, and it does the whole thing with React and the client-side framework and the Webpack, and can make a very efficient website that's sort of a bit like a sort of all client-side and page switching, and there are a few. Next.js is a popular one as well. So you can get some very sophisticated these static site generators that will generate sites that are very efficient. I find it's good enough to I like to keep things simple, particularly for a demonstration. So I just have some a gulp process that uses some JavaScript and Node.js to sort of generate the content that I want to. But you could also use these very sophisticated things that, you know, in some cases maybe more sophisticated than you need. But that's it depends what you're trying to build. So if you're building something that's very app-like, then it makes sense to use something that's going to generate something using client-side framework like React. If it's more of a sort of a web content-y type site, then I'm not sure that's not just adding more complexity and getting you a bit more performance that you maybe don't need. So that's creating a static app. I've already got one of these set up as well. So this is an Azure static web app, same idea, but this one is being deployed from GitHub. So I've got Visual Studio Code here. I'll just show you the source for this particular site, which one is it? Reverse management. So that's I've got some source folder here, which has got some markdown and a template. So this is how I get my Chrome around the site. Is I've got a template and a very crude templating language here that drops some content in there. And the content comes from these markdown files. And so there's a gulp process that goes through and runs through all the files and does things like uses this conversion from SCSS to CSS, from SAS to CSS, and generates this output folder, which is www. I tend to do this at sort of locally and generate this, but you can also do that as part of the deployment process as well to generate that. And that's all the static site is in this www folder. So that's all that gets, that's all that the server, as it were, can see. And so and then what I do is I'd go into here and I'd do a commit and a push, and that gets pushed up. And that site is at it's a very simple site, but all of that. So there is a bit of, so there's a header and a footer and a menu. There's not much in there. It's just a demo site. But these are, everything inside here has come from Markdown, and then everything out, all the rest of it, the header and footer and so on, is from that template page. But as I say, there are lots of pre-built frameworks for you to do this. There's a bewildering array to choose from. I think seem to be about 100 of these, depending on which language you want to use and how well supported you want it to be as well. But the whatever language and whatever templating engine you prefer, there'll be one that does this for you. As I say, I do it from just sort of hand coded from scratch. But that's basically it. So that this page is being served from, or this site is being served from a. I think this one's a static web app. I can't actually remember. And I've also got one that's using a. That is this is CDN profile OpenCFT. Yeah, this one is using. Let me just go to this one as well. It's a very similar. That page there is actually being served from a static. Well, it's the same idea, but it's being served from a storage account, and then Azure CDN is actually delivering the content. But it's all on the so even though it's set up like this, should be able to just type in, hope this works, opencfd.com. That everything resolves correctly. But this is a little bit trickier to set up. With the static website approach, the custom domains are pretty easy to configure. You can have Azure CDN in front of it if you want to, but you don't have to, and they will pretty much take care of getting certificates for you. You do still have to have an alias record, which is what I've done here for the root domain for it, but and that's because most DNS providers don't allow you to have a CNAME to the root directory, so you have to use this alias record. But other than that, it's probably, I would say this is the easiest and quickest way of getting a website up and running, whether you use something like Gatsby or you just roll your own, which is what I do.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us on today's episode of the Tech Talk. So I think this is how much time is going to allow us on today's episode. But let me check with you if there's any last words from you before we say bye-bye now.
So I would say if you can build static websites, it just keeps your options open. So you can, once you've adopted this approach, and if you've got any data, build use something like Azure Functions, so everything's serverless now. And even if you decide, hey, I'm going to continue using app service, or I've got the option, I can deploy it to a VM, to app service. I could deploy it to a container if I wanted to, or I could use any of these other options. And the CDN will make it super efficient as well. So I'm kind of moving towards doing everything static now, rather than have it just keeps everything simple, and and content in Markdown. I think it makes it a really simple way of doing it. So yeah, take a look if you're not already doing that.
Okay. So you've heard it from Bill today on the Tech Talk, on today's episode of the Tech Talk. So remember, you can have a rewatch of the previous episode on YouTube. So it's the Tech Talk Wednesday on YouTube. And so remember, you can follow us on social media as well. So it's Tech Talk Wednesday across the different social media channels. So from myself now and Bill, it's a bye-bye. So let's continue to keep safe and let's do this again another time.
Thanks, Kazeem. Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.